something very striking happens in this week's Torah reading. Israel's ready to go into the land. Moses is getting everything organized. We're right on the verge, right about. And then two tribes come up to Moses and say, do we really have to go? And it's an astounding question, because they're not just asking, do we have to go? They're actually saying, we'd rather not. We'd rather not go. Two tribes out of Israel are coming to Moses and saying, things look good right here, on the other side of the Jordan. This will be better for our sheep, better for our cattle. This is where we want to settle. Do we have to go? And it's as if you'd planned your whole life to move to Israel, and you raised your children, and every dollar saved, everything you planned, every orientation was the family's moving to Israel. And it takes you 20, 30 years to accumulate everything you need, and just as you're about to board that plane, two of your kids come and say, we don't want to go. And Moses does exactly what you would expect in that moment. He turns to them and says, I'm not even going to discuss it. No, yes, you have to go. Not even going to open that discussion. And he then goes back and says, 40 years ago, we had spies. Spies came out of the land and said, we don't want to go. And it cost the people everything. It demoralized them. It made them look away from the goal. It caused them to doubt everything. You're now doing the same thing. You're now raising and saying, you don't want to go. Well, it's not open for discussion. But the two tribes say, yes, it is open for discussion, and we want to discuss it. And from there, what gets negotiated is the deal. How does it work out if someone doesn't want to move to Israel? Someone doesn't want to live in Israel. What do we do with that within a Jewish frame? And Moses works out something with them that basically says, you can settle here if you want, but when the rest of the nation goes in, you go in too. And you're part of the army, and you're part of making sure everyone there is secure, and you're part of settling the land, and you're part of the vision. And once it's all done, you can return and settle there. So what we're watching occur is the simultaneous definition of Jews inside of Israel and outside of Israel. What's being set up, and what we're reading this week, is that when the Israelites go into the land and then settle that land, at the same moment, there are Israelites who are in the diaspora. And the two communities now emerge simultaneously. And this will be the reality of the Jewish people from that moment moving forward all the time. And it really does raise that question about, what do we do? Do we all have to live there? And as we track the growth of the people and what goes on, we see that later in the Tanakh it does cause a problem. After Joshua has settled the land, and these two tribes do live up to that idea that we have to be protecting each other, settling the land, always keeping an eye on peoplehood, that it shouldn't be geography, it is peoplehood. Great. Then as the generations continue and Joshua has settled the land, now what happens is everyone living in Israel notices that the two tribes outside built a huge altar right on the border. And it makes everyone in Israel very nervous. Because now they're saying, is that a power grab? Are they saying that they want to move the authority outside of Israel and put it in there, Transjordan? What's that altar? You're not allowed to give sacrifices outside of Israel at that time. They should be heading to Jerusalem. What's going on? Are they competing? And without communicating back and forth, an army is struck, off we go to the border on the brink of civil war. And at that point, a message is sent to the two tribes saying, what's that? What's that altar you built? And they answer and say, it's not an altar, it's a symbol. Why are you standing there with an army? And the beginning of the discussion occurs where the two tribes are saying, we were worried that our children would not know what's going on in the land, that they won't feel connected, that they'll feel the distance because they're living outside the land. So we headed to symbols. We headed to things that would be meaningful to them, that would create that common language and that common bond. We were worried about continuity. And it caused everything to calm down. but it raises a very real question. And that is, how are the connections maintained? The two tribes saw it. They realized they're outside the land. How are the connections maintained? And as we continue to go through history, we see that throughout history, we do have this bit of a push and pull of where is the authority? Is it sitting in the land of Israel? Is it sitting outside the land of Israel? We know that we have two Talmuds. One is the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. It's formed in the land of Israel. The other is the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. It's formed in Babylon outside the land of Israel. And the Babylonian is the one that becomes authoritative, not the Jerusalem one. And when we look inside the Talmuds, we realize they're designating difference, because some people are called Rav and some people are called Rabbi, Rav and Rabbi. And when you look at the distinction is geographic. A Rav is someone who lives outside of Israel. A Rabbi is someone who lives inside of Israel. And why is the Talmud making these distinctions? Both Talmuds are making those distinctions, because what the two tribes understood is the reality of living outside Israel will change the people who are living there. It's a different culture. It's most often a different language. It's a different day-to-day reality. So could the authority in Israel speak as relevantly to the people who are living outside? Or is it in fact a different reality? And one of the solutions was to say, well then, when you read a ruling from a rabbi, you will know, is that rabbi living in the land or outside the land? So that you will know how directly is that speaking to your reality. This goes on right from the very beginning and continues throughout time. Halachically, we ask the same question. Does every Jew need to actually be living in Israel throughout their lives? And the answer halachically is there are reasons where we would choose not to. One reason would be livelihood. That's the reason the two tribes are raising. They're saying this land is where we can make a living because of the pastures. I'm not so sure about the land over there. A lot of it is mountain. So livelihood and being able to support ourselves and being able to support our family, there's a reason where one might say, I can't do that in Israel. Another reason would be education. We are commanded to educate ourselves and our children. So what do we do with that commandment and now the commandment to live in Israel, and they're not really aligning and speaking with each other? So Jewish law says, well, education is a reason where one might say at this moment in time, it's just not going to fit. And the third is to find a partner, to find a life partner. That if to find a life partner means I can't be in Israel, I have to leave Israel, or I have a better chance to find a life partner where I am, and where I am might be outside of Israel, then halachically, that is what you do. We search for life partners. So there are reasons, even within the law, that are telling us, watch this carefully, because it's a dynamic of relationship. It's not only a dynamic of geography. I remember speaking with friends of ours years ago, and their kids had all grown up, and the kids had all made aliyah to Israel. And here are the parents sitting in Toronto, and they have no immediate family. All their kids moved to Israel. And they turned half-jokingly and said, you see, you raise Zionists, and then they moved to Israel. I can't believe they did that. And then, of course, you're listening to them and you're thinking, wow, I'm not sure you're really joking, but there really is that bittersweet moment of we connected our kids to Israel, and then they moved to Israel, and we're like the mother bird in the nest going, where are you going? I mean, I gave you roots and wings, but I really didn't expect you to cross an ocean. It's always this dynamic tension that occurs in our relationship with Israel. We feel conflicted about it. It's a Western country, but it's not sitting in the West. And we are sitting in the West. And so we watch it and we're thinking, another election? That's another election you're going to have? What is that like? How many elections are you having in such a small amount of time? And what's going on socially over there? And what's going on day to day over there? And Jewishly, what's going on over there? And we often can sit in moments of confusion about the relationship with Israel. And actually, it's not a new moment in Jewish history. As we've seen in today's Torah reading, it's a very old moment in Jewish history. those two tribes began something that we are now sitting in, and we are living the reality that says the relationship with Israel is complicated. But then we're going to sit there and say, of course it's complicated. Israel is our covenantal land, and covenant is complicated. So of course we're going to have 150 different political parties over there. Of course we're going to sit there and say, okay, now make coalitions that, oh my goodness, my head is spinning. If it wasn't complicated, it wouldn't fit us. Covenant tells us the nature of our people is to hear all the voices and to give room for all the voices and to validate them and to expand our thinking and to make it complicated. So in fact, what the two tribes are doing is beginning that as they should be beginning that for us. The question doesn't sit in our relationship with the land. It sits in how we make sure our children and the children living in Israel actually can recognize each other and can find what they have in common. That's what the two tribes were saying. That's why they built the symbol of the altar. Oftentimes we get stuck in questions of identity. Are our kids Canadian Jews or Jewish Canadians? And we have that discussion with them, and we're trying to parse it out. And then in Israel, they're having the discussion, are they in fact Israeli Jews or Jewish Israelis? Which one is the modifier? And we sit there and we go through it back and forth about exactly what's going on with the identity because it's so layered and it's so complicated. But then, of course, as we stand in Torah and we read the beginning moment where it all started, it told us clearly, make sure it's the relationship the children have with each other. Make sure that they are standing together, understanding what it is when we say one peoplehood, no matter where anybody is, and make sure that it's the values of that peoplehood and the beliefs of that peoplehood that transcend everything else that complicates all of it. We owe so much to those two tribes who spoke up with one question that simply said, do we have to? Shabbat Shalom, everyone.